Hymn 706, number 1, by Josiah Conder, 18th century. In your mercy, Lord, you called me, taught my sin-filled heart and mind, else this world had still enthralled me, and to glory kept me blind. Still nothing on the atonement. And the precisionists who put that together. Precisionists. History of Israel by Heinrich, Ewald. Vol.1, Introduction, Prehistory, with a preface and appendix by Russell Martineau. A little quip here from Fuller. The Old Testament will still be a New Testament to him who comes with a fresh desire of information. Published in London by Longmans, Green and Company, 1876. This would be a gateway for the entrepot of liberal theology in England and Scotland and America. It is a truncated view of God, a broken view of God, maybe worse than that. Digitized in the University of Toronto, which is Dad's alma mater. The preface. I'm being asked to write a preface to the translation of a portion of Professor Ewald's Geschichte des Volkes Israel. My first impulse was to reply that such a work needed none. The author is known to be one of the most intellectually powerful, as well as most learned and accurate of the Hebraists and biblical scholars of his day. Oops, what happened there? Oops, what happened? Oh, there it is there. Sorry about that. In his History of Israel, his largest and perhaps his greatest work. Give me a second, there we go. Is acknowledged by both friends and foes to be striking, original, and ingenious. And that being already not merely known by name, but read and studied at our universities. It has gained a standing among us which could not be made securer by any words of mine. I was confirmed by many expressions in Dean Stanley's widely read works, especially the following. It is now 27 years since Arnold wrote to Bunsen what Wolfe and Niebuhr have done for Greece, and Rome seems sadly wanted for Judea. The wish thus boldly expressed for critical and historical investigation of the Jewish history was in fact already on the eve of accomplishment. At that time, Ewald was only known as one of the chief Orientalists in Germany. He had not proved himself to be the first biblical scholar in Europe, but year by year he was advancing toward his grand object. To his profound knowledge of the Hebrew language, he added step by step a knowledge of each stage of Hebrew literature. These labors on the prophetic and poetic books of the ancient scriptures culminated in his noble work, The History of the People of Israel. Is powerful in its general conception as it is saturated with learning down to the minutest details. It would be presumptuous in me either to defend or attack the critical analysis, which to most English readers savors of arbitrary dogmatism, with which he assigns special dates and authors to the manifold constituent parts of the several books of the Old Testament. Arbitrary dogmatism. And from many of his general standpoints, I should venture to express my disagreement, were this the place to do so. But the intimate acquaintance which he exhibits with every portion of the sacred writings combined as it is with a loving and reverential appreciation of each individual character, of the whole spirit and purpose of the Israelitish history, has won the respect even of those who differ widely from his conclusions. How vast its silent effect has been may be seen from the recognition of its value not only in the author's own country, but in France and England also. One instance may suffice: the constant reference to his writings throughout the New Dictionary of the Bible, to which I myself have so often referred with advantage, and which, more than any other single English work, is intended to present the knowledge and meet the wants of a rising generation. Strange, what is it? This is kind of weird. Moreover, Dean Stanley does not stand alone. Dr. Roland Williams speaks of Ewald, whose faculty of divination, what does that mean? Compounded of spiritual insight and of immense learning. I not do praise, because praise for me would be presumption. And Ernst Renan, tracing the history of Semitic theology, a French quote here, and on Ewald's merits in the elucidation of particular books. Dr. Ginsburg testifies thus of his treatment of Ecclesiastes. After tracing these ingenuous conceits, it is cheering to come to Ewald, whose 4 pages on Koheleth, subjoined to his work on Song of Solomon, contains more critical acumen and a clearer view of the design of the book than many a bulky volume noticed in this sketch. Again, another quote from Renan. But further consideration convinced me that a few words of introduction would not be out of place, were in fact necessary to indicate to the general reader the point of view from which the work must be judged. The term history has a very wide scope, embracing, apart from significations which have become obsolete in particular connections, natural history, all that can be told or known respecting the past. Its application varies according to as the historian thinks this or that series of facts best worth recalling. We thus have histories of kings and courts, battles and sieges, treaties and legislation, civilization and the arts. All these and more are perfectly legitimate subjects of history, since the only point on which all are agreed seems to be that its subject must be something deserving serious inquiry. We speak of the dignity of history. I wonder if we're going to talk about the God of history. Not a minor omission. This is why we do old, new, systematic church history, practical and contemporary. The dignity of history. And now we're going to see if God's been. Thank you, God. We no longer need your services. You can go sit in the corner. This is inevitable from the various conditions under which a historian works. When recounting an event of yesterday of which he himself and 1,000 other living men were eyewitnesses, he needs only to recount the event itself in the clearest passage. When recording an event of 100 years ago, which there are abundant contemporary accounts extant, his duty is different. He must sift these accounts and prepare his story from the most trustworthy. When speaking of what happened 1,000 years ago, the paucity or the discrepancy in the notice says he finds that the event may be so serious as to make it impossible to give a connected narrative at all. History, therefore, still properly describes a work of this character. No one would deny the history of Hellenic tribes and cities, Dorians, Minions, of Ottfried Müller, nor opening part of Niebuhr's History of Rome. The value of a history does not depend on the vividness of its colors, or in other words, the positiveness of its assertions. It is natural to prefer a clear picture to a misty, and the craving for distinctness has led former storytellers to make their colors bright and clear, and to eschew the question whether the subject is really as clear as they make it. Such thoughtlessly and artlessly composed stories, which were formally accepted as real history, it is the duty of the earnest and critical historian to sift and analyze, separating the gaudy surface coloring from the plain reality which lies beneath, or removing utterly away the surface coloring which covers nothing at all. This has been done by recent writers for the histories of India, Greece, Rome, England, and greatly to the comfort and satisfaction of readers who read history as a record of what really happened in the past. It is so much more natural to find the oldest times the obscurest. Here we go. The most destitute of distinct persons and accurate computation of years, and then to advance slowly but surely towards greater clearness and sureness, and to begin with family stories which profess to know the most secret affairs of home and nursery. There's a lot of words here, and I'm not sure what's going on. Hence, the present work, even its introductory portion, claims to be a history of Israel, although no lucid and connected narrative will be found in it, as is generally associated with that term. The earliest period of the life of the Hindus, Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans is now called mythical, and is shrouded in mist where all appeared clear before historians had seriously endeavored to separate the possible from the impossible, the true from the fabulous. The same is found to be the case with all nations whose history we have adequate means to trace. The legends, which had till lately been treated as actual history, are in many cases proved by the existence of true history of their heroes, along the legendary to be mythical, if not simply fictitious. He's got a footnote. Mythical and fictitious are not synonymous. The myth has for its basis an actual event, or at least a thought, dressed in poetical allegory, while fiction is the mere invention of the narrator. This is the case with Charlemagne, the center of the whole cycle of romance. Attila and the Huns, introduced in the Nibelung cycle, with the stories of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, possibly with the Arthurian cycle of romances. Coincidence of this story is the deluge of the giants. The 4 ages of the world are familiar instances. Stories of this class may, like the former, have a basis of fact, but the differentia of the latter developments must be due to the imagination. If the mythical system has demanded at our hands the sacrifice of some cherished ideas, we find comfort and compensation not only in feeling that, after all, there is no real beauty but in truth, but also in the new light which we now see in history. The myth covers an event or a thought, generally grander than itself. Okay, so we're going to be seeing that the events and miracles in the book of Exodus are just myths. So when Ewald shows us Abraham as a representative man and his wanderings as those of a large tribe, and the quarrels between Jacob and Esau as great international struggles between Hebrew and Arabian tribes rather than a petty strife of a few herdsmen, the history assumes a grander scale than we had any idea of before, and we look with heightened eagerness for what it may disclose. Stories which before amused us with their prettiness, now tell of the fates of empires and developments of nations. And we see why they have preserved from an antiquity so high that the deeds of individuals have long been obliterated. The mythical system, therefore, as understood and wielded by its chief masters, is anything but destructive of history. Rather, so basically, history is a forgery in the past that needs a cleanup on aisle 3. Compliments of Ewald. The parting of the Jordan and Joshua, that kind of stuff. Hero embellishment. There must be a point where history begins to be literally and not allegorically true, where persons are individual men and not nations in disguise. The tact of the historian is shown in discriminating these. We want to do some Albright work, because he was just annoyed with German liberals who just would not learn. I cannot help thinking that these considerations have not been sufficiently present to some of the reviewers of the first edition, who have spoken of tradition as if it were an active force in which produced stories were something new invented by Ewald. Now, Ewald discriminates the tradition from the event it records simply as the word differs from the act, and applies it to the story told from one generation to another of the same event, hence to the process of transmission of the story. We sincerely trust that the English mind will long recognize the true grandeur of early Hebrew history, to consist not in the wanderings and squabbles of various Arab tribes, but in the presence of the living God, forming for himself that people through which all nations of the earth will be blessed. The mythical age occurs at no fixed date all the world over, but varies with the age of the nation. If in England and most of the present peoples of Europe we find its characteristics in the first 500 years of the Christian era, in Roman Greece we scarcely discover it later than 800 to 1,000 years before that era, while in Canaan, Egypt, Syria, and India it must be placed in an indefinite period earlier still. But its essential characteristics are the same everywhere, and nowhere do we find preceded by a period of greater illumination. If we penetrate further back than the age of the mythic heroes, we come only to a time when gods themselves were imagined to people of the earth with their kind. If this is true everywhere alike, we must expect to find it in Israel also, where indeed we do find the very same ideas and stories. We cannot treat the Assyrian, Persian, and Greek deluges as mythical and refuse the same character to the Hebrew, nor can we treat the Hebrew story as historical and the others as bad imitations, unless evidence supports the greater antiquity and originality of the Hebrew. We haven't heard God yet. It may sound a little intrusive to bring him in, but he just pontifical dogmatizing, arbitrary dogmatism. That's a word we want to maintain. Inquisitor from Robert Dick Wilson is another phrase. The earliest historical stories of all nations abound with pitfalls and difficulties such as we've described, and man were not man if it were anywhere otherwise. The historian must be both impartial and truth-seeking in the highest sense. He must be free to think, free to express whatever results he discovers. If his learning, and especially his experience of the earliest stages of other histories, is vast, he is entitled to not only be listened to, but heard with great deference by all who have not gone through the same studies. But if this perfect freedom of speech and thought are absolutely essential, it is obviously that there can be no orthodoxy in history. Arbitrary dogmatism. Thank God for Robert Dick Wilson, who studied all those ancient languages and can talk just as a little yo-yo boy here. Moreover, the rules of allowable belief were laid down in all dogmatic churches before history had become critical at all. Here we go. We've arrived. Germany, however, has preserved two clear advantages. First, that shares of history, even biblical history and exegesis, are given as readily to laymen as to persons and orders. Ewald himself was a layman. That's interesting. Got freedom of speech, regarded as the basis on which the constitution of a university must rest, develops far more active speculation, fiction, creation, than is produced at our seats of learning. Without the wholesome occupation of the historian's mind, we may be sure that Germany would not have given us a Niebuhr, a Bunsen, or an Ewald. See what I'm talking about? If you're listening, if you know my previous background, the Germans were a pompous breed, no humility. We ought by this time to be convinced that the biblical question can never be settled to the satisfaction of men who think for themselves and give themselves the needful preliminary knowledge that is dissociated from ecclesiastical question. Off you go, all you boys out here. Off you go. Thousands of volumes. Only in Germany. This is what they call the Enlightenment. We'll just listen to ourselves. Ewald's English critics have not understood the mythical element which he finds so fully developed in the earliest stages. Here's the Englishman. Bye-bye. Boltman does the same thing. They have therefore wasted time in trying to prove events and numbers, such as the personality and term of life of the patriarchs, just not impossible, which are in any case in the last degree improbable and totally out of keeping with surrounding events. They have spoken as if Ewald were the originator of this mode of treating. Ever since Astruc published his ideas on a composite authorship of the Pentateuch in 1753. Deeper ignorance appears to be evinced when they class Ewald with the rationalists, all those deeply ignorant men. This ought to be impossible to anyone who has found that he attributes all that distinguished the Israelites favorably from their neighbors. Again, Ewald's ideas on the composition of the Pentateuch, the other historical books, as positive and definite as long study of the Hebrew text and all thereto belonging, aided by a marvelous memory for words and phrases. Yet he is actually classed with negative critics. If negative critics exist at all, they must be such as deny without adequate reason the truth of everything that is said. And as for them, a history would not exist at all. They manifestly could not write one. The English critics. You see the nationalism. Sometimes I've wondered in the past if World War I and II wasn't a judgment on Germany. I'm not a prophet. I can only wonder as a Christian. The arrogance of the 19th century just explosively high, like the Tower of Babel. And now it's collapsed, and all those little German boys and girls are running in all different kinds of directions, kind of like American evangelicals. It's happening to them. The English critics also err most fatally in supposing that because they have read somewhere of a pathway streaming with light from Eichhorn to Ewald, and thence Keenan to Colenso might have been added. All that stand on that pathway might speak the very language and hold the same theories, that if this is not the fact, they have a right to disregard these writers, treating them as self-condemned, and return to the old ideas. It is deplorable to read such arguments. If Eichhorn, Ewald, and etc. differ in toto from one another, it only shows that all, or all but one of them, must have arrived at false conclusions. Still waiting for God to be talked about here. Wonder if Moses would like this, or Isaiah, or Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, those who wrote the Psalms. Well, you gotta go to Germany to get the pontiff's remarks. Rather, the fact that many able and independent investigators all range themselves on one side against the old ideas affords a strong presumption that whatever may be ultimately accepted as true, those at least are destined to be found false or insufficient. Sounds like somebody shouting, "We won, we won, we won." The truth must be in the numbers. Two or three are gathered together in thy name, there thou art, the Lord is. Ewald constantly pursued the principle of reading history in its oldest monuments. For that of Israel, the Bible itself was the chief storehouse of myths, tradition, and facts. Indeed, for large portions, the only record at all nearly contemporaneous. Every part of it, down to the driest lists of names and chronicles, was ransacked in the original language, compared and made to yield a rich harvest. Next in importance were the antiquities of adjacent countries which had equal antiquity and some connection with Palestine, Egypt, Phoenicia, and what had been published of cuneiform inscriptions of Babylon and Nineveh. Had Ewald's life been spared a few years longer, assuredly the latest discoveries of the Assyriologists like Lenormant, Schroeder, George Smith, and Sayce might have been used, might have been modified, what is here said, on the creation and the deluge. Next come other but not contemporary authorities, evidently studied in the original, which yield many new facts. I have in view mainly the article on this history in the Edinburgh Review, 1875, which, however, does ample justice to the spirit in which Ewald has written much of the history. As down to the history was to be deduced from that which has come down to us from age, Ewald cared not to see how other modern writers had dealt with the same materials. Really. It's weird. Don't care about anybody else. Hence, I should imagine this will bring in our work with psychiatry, mood disorders, narcissism. That a few historical works contained in the notes so many valuable original references to ancient writers, to a few stock quotations, references to recent writers, are very few. His mode of action, betokening a manly and independent spirit, is surely not only defensible but admirable. There is indeed another side to the question. If Ewald had been less absorbed in his own studies and more open to influences from without, he might have seen that to pass over important works on the same subject by modern writers would be set down to self-conceit and arrogance, that the neglect of them might render his book less perfect. I do not feel myself called upon to defend Ewald from this charge of arrogance. I will only observe that his time was probably more profitably employed in studying ancient authorities than reading modern books on the same subject, and that the latter, when he did read them, seemed to have repelled rather than guided his very independent mind. Another fault has been found. Ewald often furnishes in the text his version of the story without clearly giving the original form or forms of it, nor indicating the reasons for his modifications that he has introduced. No doubt this is often the case, but Generally, the desired information may be found in the notes, which are terse and contain many specific comments. A few biographical details respecting the audience may be interesting to English readers. George Heinrich August von Ewald was born in Göttingen, November 16, 1803, the child of a poor weaver of the place. The personal nobility indicated by the von prefix to the surname was conferred on him. We had better call that an end here. Pick it up next time. Verse 2, Lord, I did not freely choose you, till by grace you set me free. Or my heart would still refuse you, had your love not chosen me. Let us pray. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.